mic check? Just,
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
Excellent. All right, we're here today with Scot Dewhirst. Scott, would you spell your name? Because I know it's not the way most people spell it.
It's Scot, S-C-O-T, and the last name is Dewhirst, D-E-W-H-I-R-S-T.
And we're here on September 9th, I think it is, 2015.
It surely is.
Scott, if you would please, just take us back to the beginning at first and tell me in general how you got here, why you got here, that sort of thing.
Okay. I grew up on a farm in southern Ohio and moved to Columbus when I went to Ohio State. And from Ohio State went to Capital Law School and graduated from Capital Law School in 1978. I started working at the courthouse down at Fulton and High. So I was in that area, but I was living up kind of near campus still in the Thurber Village area, and started looking for a house after I graduated from law school, and was looking for a house. I wanted an older home. I grew up in an old home. I liked older neighborhoods. So I was looking for a house kind of up in the Victorian Village area, but this again was 1979. And I frankly looked at a couple houses there with my realtor and thought, you know, I don't really feel safe there. I had just come out the year before. Now this was, again, 1978, 79, so times were totally different at that point. So even though you might be out, those were still concerns about jobs, and, you know, I was working for the government, you know, for the city, and, you know, so you had to be a little bit more careful about the image that you projected at that time, I think, from a political point of view. And I didn't really feel safe in the Victorian Village area. I looked at some houses that were wonderful houses. Now, 30 years later, I wish I would have bought some of those houses. And then so I started looking. My realtor said, well, let's check out German Village. I didn't really know much about German Village at the time. And he called me one day when I was in New York City visiting a friend, and said, I found the perfect house for you, because he had been my realtor for about 6 to 9 months. And he said, but it's just coming on the market tomorrow. It's not going to be available for very long. If you want it, you're going to have to make an offer on it. And so I called my father, and I called a friend who came and looked at the house, and I put an offer in on a house I had never seen before in German Village when I was in New York City. And by the time I got back from New York City, I owned the house. As far as I had still to do the closing, but it was a house right on Frankfurt Street between City Park and 3rd, right near Max and Irma's, a double house. What attracted me to the German Village area? Obviously, it was known, you know, to be a gay-friendly area. I was still coming to grips with my own outness at that time, and I wanted to be a place where I would be comfortable. It obviously had an attractiveness to it because I could walk to work, you know, from that location, and I just loved the old home. So that's really about how it happened without me knowing a whole lot of what I was getting into. I will say the irony, even though I served on the German Village Commission for 12 years, the irony was I bought the house, didn't even know that the concept of historic preservation or commissions existed. You know, as lots of people that buy into German Village did not know that that existed at the time.
You know, the realtors don't, I think they're much better these days, but they didn't always come right out with saying there's a commission and you're going to have to get an approval for your paint color. And
it was kind of looked at as that, you know, well, it's nice, you know, it kind of helps the neighborhood, but we don't want to make too much of an issue of it. I mean, there was still the concept of people are hesitant to buy properties if somebody else can tell them what they can do with them, especially with how they look. You know, so that was kind of a surprise to me when I found out that there was such a thing as a commission that could control what happened.
Now that was 20 years into the, almost 20 years into the restoration down here. What did the neighborhood look like, say, compared to today in 2015?
You know, I will interestingly enough say not that much different, which is exactly, I think, the value of historic preservation. I mean, clearly there were more transitional homes. You know, this was 1979, so there were the homes that, you know, there would be wonderful houses that had been redone, and then there would still be houses in between that maybe hadn't been redone at that point. But as far as the stability of the neighborhood, you know, the remainder of the structures still being there, you know, they're all still there. Some of them look a little different now from the street as far as being in a better state of repair or restoration, you know, but it kind of looks the same, which I think is a good indicator of the success of the village.
That's kind of neat. And then how long did you live down here?
I lived in that house from 1979 until 1993, and I still own the house to this day.
Oh,
So I use it as it's a double, so I rent out both sides of it. I've had one tenant that moved in after me that she's been there for almost 20 years, so I still have my links to the village, and my office was here, so after I left the city, I had a couple different offices in the German Village area, one on 3rd Street, one on Pearl Avenue. So my professional career kind of was focused, even after I left the city and was in private law practice.
and even today, you're pretty close with your law.
Yeah, I'm right over on Town Street, so I'm in a historic area still.
Now, where do you live?
An old house. I live now in Victorian Village,
Okay.
so I went back to that area. I bought a house in the Circles area. It kind of was I guess if we're going to go full circle and full disclosure, I was, by the time I was becoming more successful, and I lived in a smaller duplex. I wanted to have more space and a larger single-family home, and I couldn't afford it in German Village. To the credit of the village, the kind of place I wanted, I couldn't afford it down here, and there weren't that many of them here. So I found a wonderful old Queen Anne Victorian in the Circles area up near Ohio State, and I've been there since 1993.
And now you've seen that neighborhood come up.
And that area has just done tremendously. I mean, the houses that I still drive by periodically at some of the homes that I looked at in 1979 when I went through them with the intent of potentially buying them, and said, yeah, I should have bought that 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been a wonderful investment, and so that's another success story, is in that area.
Moving into a neighborhood back in '79 when it still wasn't accepted by most people to be gay, and to be moving into a neighborhood that had a reputation as being gay friendly, was that any concern to you, just the fact that you were a single man living in a neighborhood where a lot of men were gay? Did that in itself pose any threat to your livelihood?
Posed a threat? No, it was one of the attractivenesses that wanted me to be down here. That it was a place that I was at the point when I finally came out, and I came out when I was 25, almost 26, so older, at least by standards now. That was much more the norm back then. After I was in school and in law school, it was like, okay, now let's get the personal life together. And I wanted to be in a place that I felt comfortable, that I felt accepted, and that was, clearly the image that German Village had at that time.
I've had a question for a lot of people, gay and straight, and most of them have a little bit of trouble answering this, so I'm curious as to what you would say. Why was this considered a safe, if I might say, or nurturing neighborhood for gay men back then?
Why? I've thought about that question lots. There wasn't any place else. That's the first one, I think. So, it was a place that you tried to develop a community. You tried to develop an area where there were other people like you. So I think that was one of the reasons. So there was no place else to go. So it was a place that people, had homesteaded, so to speak, had created that feeling. Clearly, then when other people that were non-gay people moved into the neighborhood or were in the neighborhood, it made it a very welcoming environment. I can think of a party that I went to down here that I took a male date with me, one of the first times I had done that. And, I was with people from German Village and people who were successful in their careers, and opposite sex couples and straight couples and single people. And it was like everybody was okay. Everybody was comfortable with everybody else, and you were allowed to be who you were. And I had never, ever experienced that in my entire life. That, the neighborhood you were living in, the people that you would spend large amounts of your time with, just said, you're a part of, you're a part of our neighborhood. And everybody in that neighborhood is okay. And that was clearly a feeling in German Village. Now, why else? Obviously, a lot of the culture at that time, in addition to, was done more privately. We didn't have as many public events or public activities or public organizations. So, having that community sense was important. I think also, the bar environment, which was where a lot of gay life, went on as far as from a social perspective. That was focused in the downtown area. Some of that was focused in German Village, even though I think the rest of the city thought that German Village was filled with gay bars, which it never was. There were a couple on the fringes that were popular places to go to. So I think there was also that attractiveness, the closeness to, the gay lifestyle that was the lifestyle that might have been in the bars, in the perimeter of German Village, as well as most of the bars were then located in the downtown area. So German Village was close to that downtown area.
And I've never really thought about this before, but as I was leading a tour group this morning, I said, for years we haven't had a lot of children down here. We haven't had families. They come in as young adults. If it's a straight couple, they'll marry, they'll rent, they'll have kids, move out, and then come back as empty nesters. Do you think that had anything to do with the fact it was an adult community?
I think so, yes. I never quite thought of it in that way, but you're right. There weren't a lot of kids down here at that time. There were some, but that was not the norm. So it was an adult-oriented community, and it was an adult community that was an accepting community. I think the people that gravitated here, the people that were interested, in that downtown living. I mean, because, we had the flight to the suburbs for so many years, and I think this was legitimately really one of the first, environments where people were coming back in to the city. And the people that were doing that, I think, were more liberal, were more of the urban pioneer type of individuals that recognized that, they were moving into a community that had a homogeny of people, and they wanted that. And it just made it a very comforting place.
My wife and I moved here in early '92 to Columbus and to German Village. We didn't know much about the background. We just knew it was a historic community. But what we found when we moved here was that even the older people who you might think of to be a bit more conservative were very accepting of everyone down here, regardless of lifestyle. And I was a little surprised to find that.
That's what I found in '79. And that's when you met your neighbors, when you went to the parties down here, everybody just viewed everybody else as you're allowed to live the life you want to live, and that's okay in the community. And I think that's a testament to the kind of people that German Village attracted. Maybe those are the people that are the urban pioneers. Maybe it's the people that said, I want a different type of a lifestyle, that is not focused on, I don't want to say it's not focused on the family, but, but maybe I can say that as far as that was not the focus of everything in Germany, but the family in the sense of, the mother, the father, the multiple kids. It was more, like you said, an adult community that welcomed all other aspects and welcomed families, but there was a predominantly adult aspect to it.
Yeah. Why do you think it was? And this is another question we ask, and I don't know that we've gotten a definitive answer on it yet, but this seemed to be a place that attracted gay men, but not necessarily gay women. And what can you tell me about the cultures of the two lifestyles and why maybe they didn't concentrate themselves here?
When I was preparing for this interview and the presentation we did earlier on this topic, I talked to some of my friends, women friends, and said, what do they think that was about? I think there was a certain, now again, let's take us back to 1979. So we're talking, close to 40 years ago now, getting back toward 35 to 40 years ago. There was a lot more emphasis on the men at that point. The women's movement was just developing. A lot of women were not as economically self-sufficient, is what women had told me. I said, why weren't you doing the things that the gay men were doing? And it's like many of the women were in lower paying jobs, did not have the same types of income. Many women were married with children, which then further restricted their ability to do things, because that would happen a lot more, I think. Men seemed to be, you tended not to get married. You tended to have more disposable income. So it created the urban pioneer, as the men that came in and were looking for both, a living environment, but also for an investment opportunity at the same time. Because a lot of the gay men who were the pioneers in this area bought multiple properties, did multiple properties, would buy a property, redo it, sell it, move to the next one, even all within German Village. And the women that I spoke to said we didn't have the financial means to do that. So I think there was, at least from their perspective, there seemed to be a recognition that the economic viability wasn't there at that time. And the male and the female world, gay world, were not best friends all the time. So, they always didn't run in the same circles. There was a lot of more of that in German Village, but there was more of a separateness, I think, back then.
Was it just a separateness, or was there any animosity between the two groups on any level?
I don't think animosity would be a fair word. I think there was just there was some separateness that's there. I don't know how else to say it. You even felt that to a certain degree in German Village. I think part of it was different experiences. So as the gay movement was maturing, remember the Stonewall movement. The Stonewall riots. Which really started the gay movement, didn't occur until 1969. German Village had already been a historic preservation community for almost 10 years, before the movement really started its impetus. But things were still happening here in this community at that time. So I think the male and the female development of the gay sexuality developed at different speeds. And I think they weren't running on the same tracks at the time.
And it strikes me now, and I just thought of this, but it seems to me, I'm a little older too, I'm 58, it seems that in the past it might have been more acceptable among conservatives to see two women living together than maybe to see two men living together. The two men might be more suspect than the two women. You think? Maybe. But as far as, what a lot of the men in German Village were doing was they were also looking for economic opportunities. I mean, that's what created a lot of the synergy and a lot of the development that occurred down here. And there seemed to be more disposable money at that time with men than there was with women. Now, we've talked about how there was generally a good relationship between the gays and the straights down here.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was adult and for the most part, a very liberal community. Was there any tension? Do you recall any incidents?
Incidents. As I think back, and again, I moved here in 1979, I cannot think of a single incident that I relate to being gay oriented. I was comfortable walking around at all times of the night, as far as going places, coming back. That was one of the nice things about living in the area. You could walk to do lots of things or go to lots of places. I never felt a sense of fear. I never felt that was gay I don't know of any incidents of gay bashing that I could occur. You'd see those downtown, in the downtown bars that, were not that far away. I mean, you get to the northern edge of German Village, the bars were within 5 or 6 blocks, so you could theoretically even walk. So there might be things that would occur around the bars, but it didn't seem to come into German Village. I can't think of any incidents that ever made me fear for my safety. I mean, the entire time I lived in my house in German Village, I didn't have a security alarm, never felt insecure, never felt threatened in that environment. No, I didn't.
Of course, you coming here in '79, that was at the very start of the AIDS epidemic.
Early 80s, yes.
Yeah, 79, 80, 81, something like that. When there were, something was going on. It
started picking it up 82, 83 is when it really, I think, started becoming to the forefront.
What did that do to you and your neighbors down here?
I'm not sure what it did to my neighbors. I mean, I think it created a sense of panic, in the gay community as far as what was happening, and the fear for many years of not knowing what was happening, and not being able to explain that or know, how where the illness came from. I mean, now we know so much more about it. Back then, it was, the gay cancer, and was it communicable? Was it through the air? Could you get it by touching? I think there was some, general fear that never really became a hysteria. That, would people be afraid to go to restaurants that might be served by gay cooks or gay servers? And I think that was a potential issue that was there. I mean, there was also a presumption that if you were a single man and you lived in German Village, you were gay. I mean, even back then, I mean, there was kind of that perceivedness, wasn't necessarily true in all cases, but it was kind of recognized as a gay male community, that fit in with the rest of the community that was there.
Let's switch gears and talk about preservation.
Yeah.
What's your favorite preservation project down here? Or could you name a couple of your favorites?
Well, I was, again, a little bit of history. I mean, I was in the city attorney's office as an assistant city attorney when I was working for the city. I left the city in 1988, but before I left the city, I was appointed the legal counsel to the German Village Commission, as well as other boards and commissions. So that was one of my jobs when I was in the city attorney's office. So I really, even though I was living down here at that time, I started working, and attending meetings of the German Village Commission. So I got much more involved in historic preservation, at that period of time. When I left then the city in 1988, I was immediately appointed by the mayor to be on the German Village Commission. So I was on the German Village Commission from 1988 until 2000. And then after I left the commission in 2000, I was appointed to what's called the Board of Commission Appeals, which was the appeal body from the different historic preservation commissions, and served on that board and was the chair of that board for 3 to 4 years. So I served on commissions, historic commissions, for about 16 years. Favorite project? I'll sound self-serving. One of my favorite projects was the Meeting House. I was a part of the fundraising efforts, in the late 80s, early 90s, when we had the fundraising effort to develop the Meeting House. I'm not sure I have any favorites. There are so many different projects. Being on the commission for 12 years, literally hundreds and hundreds. You would see, a project, and then 10 years later, you'd see a change of that project or an addition to that project. I think some of the best were just some of the less developed homes, or some of the homes that were not in good repair, where somebody took hold of them and just turned them into wonderful homes and residences. So I probably couldn't pick out a lot. I could probably come up with more examples of maybe what we thought were some of the failures, which I don't want to talk about too loud, but things that just didn't turn out. That's one of the challenges of historic preservation. You can approve a plan or you can make recommendations. It doesn't necessarily translate into the build, as far as the quality of the materials, or the finished product, or the aesthetics of it. Even though on paper it might look one way, it might not come off that way. The scale, yeah, the scale. One of the things that I was proud of, I think, that we did as a commission was when we developed the German Village Awards, where we started viewing that as a way to begin to recognize different projects that really contributed, or individuals that contributed to the community.
I think one of the concerns of people who live here these days, and people who've been here for a while, like myself, is the scale of some of these projects. Going forward, do you see any great concern about what this neighborhood might look like 20, 30 years from now?
Oh, that's always been a concern. That's been a concern for 35 years. It's always, the concept of historic preservation, and because I got so involved in historic preservation, I've done a lot of teaching, and conducting training programs and working with other cities and their historic preservation districts. There's a concept of the streetscape, so one of the goals is to try to preserve the streetscape so that it looks the same. When you asked me one of my first questions, does it look different? No, not too much, because the streetscape is still the same. Now you go behind the houses, or you maybe check it from the back or the alleys, you'll see things that you might not see from the main street. So there is, the addition, and then the addition to the additions, or then when the addition begins to control the entire size of the house, or the addition then begins to dwarf the house. The goal was the house is supposed to be the overriding, dominating factor, that you pay attention to, and everything else should be subservient to that. It doesn't always happen. Mm-hmm. It doesn't happen. That's one of the, I guess, the negative aspects and a positive aspect at the same time. The negative aspect to success is people want to be here, and they often want to then make the house into something, and they have the disposable income to make the house into something that it was never intended to be. This was a working class neighborhood. There's a lot of different parts of German Village. The homes on the park are obviously much different than a lot of the cottages that are off the alleys, but it was predominantly a working class neighborhood for the breweries that were on the other side of High Street. And now we've got little story and a half cottages that were meant to be a story and a half cottage, and we've still got the story and a half cottage, but we've got 2,500 square feet behind the cottage, that then creates the living space. So we've lost a lot of the green space. The whole concept of the houses used to go from the main street to the alley, and then as it became more viable, then the lot splits began occurring down the middle of the lots. so that you would have the main street on the main house on the main street, but then you would have another house that would then be developed off of the alley, and then it created a whole subset of, of homes in that area. So that I think the density is one of the biggest things that's occurred. Is that a criticism? Yeah, I mean, that's probably the biggest change I think that I've seen is the change in density, of the village area. It also is what makes an urban neighborhood an exciting urban neighborhood, that there is a lot of that density that's there. Parking is a challenge, obviously, because then when you take away the green space, people lose parking, and people want to have the amenities of a suburban home, on a lot that doesn't allow for it. You want a 2-car garage or a 2.5-car garage, and where do you put them? I mean, if you're going to preserve the streetscape, you can't put them on the main street. If we've then cut off, the alleys because we've done curb cuts, we built separate structures off the alley, we've got a $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 house, and there's no place to park your car. Well, that's not unlike many communities that are very dense, but it creates a challenge for a community like Columbus because we are very car-oriented.
Aside from streetscape and green space, are there any other concerns of yours you've either seen over the past 35 years or whatever, or going forward that you, maybe a cautionary tale or just words of wisdom for the community?
Well, now we're into the redevelopments of the redevelopments. So we're now on the second, the third, the fourth time overdoing houses as far as redoing them from that perspective. So they're changing, in the environment. I mean, I think the challenge is how do we maintain the integrity, of the homes in the neighborhood while making them usable in the 21st century. That's always the challenge. I mean, I can think back years ago when I was on the commission and a person came in and had bought a little cottage and wanted to remove the roof off the cottage and put a second-story addition because he was 6'6" and the ceilings in the cottage were only 6'4". And it's like, this house doesn't work for me because the ceilings aren't high enough. And it's like the challenge was, okay, what controls here? Does the house control as the feature, that we're trying to preserve, or do we change the house to meet the needs of a temporary resident? And that's the challenge. I mean, nobody wants to hear that the house should be subservient to the people, but that is kind of the premise of historic preservation. Preserve the home, preserve the structure, and clearly we want to make those homes that work for the modern residents, but how do we preserve the integrity of the neighborhood and the homes at the same time? That to me is the biggest challenge, that as we move forward, with commissions and with developments and with the ability of people wanting more space, can they do that in a neighborhood like German Village any longer? I mean, it's kind of done, in the sense of, almost every property here has been done, and now we're trying to say, now what's the next change to that house that we're going to do? And then does it survive? Does the original house survive there somewhere?
Right. I have one more question, and that's going to Sarah's sheet here, and
Yeah.
I apologize for switching gears again, but it's a very important question, I think, about the LGBTQ community, and that is, do you think, and if so, how do you think that the gay population here in German Village has affected perhaps the acceptance of gays on a wider scale?
Yeah, I think it's something that we should be totally proud of here. I mean, because acceptance, I mean, let's start back. I'm one individual, but I moved here, 30 plus years ago because of that, even at the beginning of that movement, because it felt like it was a safe place. German Village, I think, has always been recognized as being a liberal, not overly liberal, but a liberal, welcoming community that everybody was allowed to be themselves. And clearly that's how it developed. I think it set a model for the city because so many people wanted to live here. I mean, the mayor moved here, down the street. I helped him move in, unpack the boxes. I mean, people would pitch in to help each other from those perspectives. Different city council people lived here. Other people that were heads of businesses, as well as students, because Capital Law School, was just across the street for many, many years, right, on High Street there. So it was a combination of a community of residents, of older people. There was always we could call it the indigenous population, the people that originally owned the homes, and then the concept of the gentrification, of German Village over the years, gradually, as those people, gave up those homes, or, as the years passed and they passed on, the nature of the community changed. But I think it was always viewed as a welcoming community. I think many of the same people that were the leaders of the movement, and I guess let's say the gay leaders of the movement, since that's what we're talking about here in German Village, transferred that to Old Town East. I mean, historically, I don't know how much you know about the areas, but German Village was first. And then it wasn't going to be Victorian Village or Italian Village. Old Town East was going to be the next, gay mecca, the next development zone. And those are really some of the most beautiful housing stocks in the community are down Bryden Road and out toward, the conservatory area through there. And a lot of the same pioneers who were the gay men in German Village began to move to that area. For lots of reasons that are too complicated to go into here, that area never boomed in the same way. It didn't have the same base of perhaps businesses, restaurants that created an area to come into, but a lot of the homes were redone there. You mentioned the AIDS epidemic. A lot of the people that moved to the Old Town East area that were the pioneers there and that were redoing the homes along Bryden Road were heavily affected by the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and early 90s. And so a lot of the homes that were being redone became a part of estates, and that movement then began to wane a little bit in that area. But at the same time, then the Victorian Village, the Short North area, began to come up. And instead of then the effort going out into the Bryden Road area, it shifted, to the area north of downtown, into Victorian Village and Italian Village and those zones, and the movement shifted there. So some of the same people went from German Village to the Old Town East, and then from Old Town East into the Victorian Italian Village area, and then we now have, I think a welcoming community on all sides. I mean, clearly wonderful things have happened in Old Town East. It's kind of been an up and a down over the years as far as the actual continuation of the development there, but it's got wonderful potential still.
If I understand you correctly, and if I understand correctly that gay men may have been more heavily concentrated down here in the 60s, 70s, 80s, particularly 70s and 80s, and now we don't have quite that concentration. We're still very gay friendly. Is it because these other neighborhoods have become more welcoming, or the city as a whole has become more welcoming, and therefore people feel more comfortable moving into other neighborhoods?
I think it's all of the above. I mean, I think we have to say that, as the gay movement developed, it became more acceptable. I don't think it's just a coincidence that it's still centered, in the downtown arena area, in Victorian Village, Italian Village, German Village, Old Town East, those areas. I mean, I think it is the urban pioneer spirit that is still there. Those are, and even though now the gay community is becoming more focused on family and marriage, that we now have that wasn't the case in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and even in the 2000s. That the family wasn't really possible as much. So there wasn't the need to be in suburbia. I mean, there would always be the joke that if you were going to go to Dublin or to Worthington or one of those places, you packed an overnight bag, because you were going like on a trip, because people were so used to being in the downtown arena area. So the downtown Center City area felt comfortable. It wasn't as focused on the family, on schools, and those types of things. So I think then the gay community just focused in those areas. Let's face it, lots of good things came from that. As far as development of the businesses and the redevelopment of the homes, it wasn't just the gays that were doing that, but I think we can say that they were a lot of the pioneer leaders of those movements in all those different communities, because a lot of the same people that were the pioneers in German Village then did shift, to Italian in Victorian Village. You know, there would even be the joke that, oh, you're deserting German Village. I mean, that would be the normal, you know, mantra you would get from somebody when you said, I'm moving from German Village to Victorian Village or to the other side of town. It was almost a feel like you were deserting, and some people felt that. So I think there's a little less, perhaps, emphasis on, you know, German Village being the gay enclave now, and it's probably more focused in Victorian Village and Italian Village, but, you know, I think the whole world is just viewing that differently too.
Scott, that's about all I have. Do you have any parting comments for us?
No, I mean, I'm still involved here. I still own property here. You know, I still think, am I going to come back here one day? I mean, you know, the sense of German Village, unlike other parts of the city that I've lived in, there is a real sense of community here. And I still feel that since I'm here quite a bit. You know, it is a wonderful community to be a part of. I mean, and I still feel like, you know, I mean, I moved from here 22 years ago. You know, if I would point to the 5 houses that were directly around the house that I lived in 23 years ago, the exact same people live in those homes, you know, 23 years later. So even though I don't live in that house anymore, it's all the same neighbors are still there, you know. So there is a sense of community that's there that I think German Village should be so proud of, that it is still viewed as a welcoming community. And it should be so proud of its heritage as far as, you know, leading the way, you know. And I think whenever anybody talks about, you know, the openness, you know, and the comfortableness that especially gay men and women would feel in the city of Columbus, it comes back to German Village. That's where it started, you know, and that's something we should all be proud of.
Excellent.
Great.
Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.